When it comes to sleep, we've all heard that sleep duration and getting 8 hours of sleep is super important, but a lot of people do not look at getting sleep quality. You can sleep all the hours in the world, and if you do not get quality sleep, you're still going to wake up chronically tired. So I think the first thing we need to focus on is getting quality sleep. So we have 4 stages to our sleep cycle, and the 5th stage is called REM sleep, and we'll get into that in a second. But stage 1 is when we're drowsy. So not really sleeping here, but we're basically in the process of falling asleep. Goes all the way until stage 4, which is our last stage of non-REM sleep. And this is our slow wave sleep. And this is part of our very deep sleep, which is the most important part of our sleep that a lot of people are lacking. So if you look at an EEG and they study how people are sleeping, you'll see that the waves of their sleep are very low frequency and high amplitude in this slow wave sleep. That's how it got the name. It's basically these giant tsunamis that are coming one at a time. And the other stages are basically the exact opposite. Now, if you look at REM sleep, this is the most different out of all of them. But if you look at REM sleep on an EEG, this is really similar to you being awake. So if you were just looking at an EEG and you looked at one was REM sleep and one was someone being awake, and you're just basing it off that, it'd be hard for you to tell which one is someone being awake or someone being in REM sleep. Now, our REM sleep is very interesting because this is where our dreaming will occur. And it got the name from rapid eye movement because when they were studying people in their sleep, they saw that people's eyes were darting back and forth over and over. It's kind of like they're watching a very fast television show. And that's how it got the name REM sleep or rapid eye movement. So when I talk about deep sleep, I'm referring to the last 2 stages, your slow wave sleep and your REM sleep, because these are the restorative and the healing stages of our sleep. And these are the 2 that I want so many people to improve on getting because so many people are lacking. So these are the 2 stages I'm going to focus on. One of the best ways to improve deep sleep is by adjusting your breathing. Our goal is to take silent and slow breaths through your nose all night long. So I want you to check your breathing right now. See how you're breathing. Are you able to breathe through your nose in a silent and calm way? If you're not, then there's a little issue, and I'm not going to get into too much on adjusting your breathing. That's in a separate video I'm going to talk about. I'm going to put a link to that video in the description below. The way you breathe is one of, if not the biggest impacts on your sleep. One thing that's happened to westernized people specifically is we have become over breathers. We're breathing too much. And this is something that we see all the time, especially in dentistry. We actually do an airway exam every single time we see patients. Now, it's not like a major thing. This is just a subtle thing that we do as we're doing all the other things that we're doing. So it starts as people are sitting right in that waiting room, and we see how they get up and they walk to the chair. And one of the first things we check for is if they switch to mouth breathing. Now, not every dentist does this. I personally do. There's a lot out there that do, but some of them don't. Just so if you see your dentist and they don't talk about this, then don't make it a big deal. But if their mouth's open, they start mouth breathing right away, that's a bad sign. It's a sign that they've become a mouth breather and they are over breathing. So if you are a mouth breather, and you may also find the need to take big breaths to catch your air because you feel like you just don't have enough air, those are all bad signs. Those are signs that you are an over breather. Now, our breathing has changed a lot in the last few centuries. And again, I'm not going to get too into this in this podcast. I'm going to talk more about this in a different one, I promise. But our breathing has changed a lot in the last few centuries, and specifically in the last century. And part of that has to do with us eating more processed foods and all these fast foods being so readily available, and our chronic stress, which has gone up, and also our lifestyles. We're just a lot more sedentary now. If you look at the history of our hunter-gatherers, they were always exercising, always foraging for food. But now our lifestyles have gotten a lot more relaxed. And all these things have contributed to this change in our breathing. You might not think it's a big deal. Like, what's the big deal if we're breathing differently now than we did before? Because air is still coming in and out of our lungs, right? But when you realize that this change in breathing can contribute to a whole list of diseases, including sleep apnea, insomnia, ADHD, high blood pressure, heart disease, the list goes on, then you start to wonder, first of all, how that can even happen, and also, how can we fix this? So right now, it's estimated that about 30 million Americans have sleep apnea. Now, this is people who are actually diagnosed with sleep apnea. But it's also estimated that about 80% of the people who have sleep apnea have not gotten tested and are still undiagnosed. So what exactly happens in sleep apnea? I mean, we know that you get these sleep disturbances where you wake up in the middle of the night and you stop breathing. And a lot of people who have sleep apnea are chronically tired because they're not sleeping well. So the apnea-hypopnea index is basically something that measures your sleep apnea severity. And this was developed by the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. So it's a combined average of the number of apneas or hypopneas per hour of sleep. So an apnea is where you are basically forced to stop breathing, and a hypopnea is where your body oxygen level has dropped. So your oxygen saturation goes down because when you're holding your breath, you don't get new oxygen and your oxygen saturation goes down. So a mild event of sleep apnea, or a mild rating of sleep apnea, is when you have 5 to 15 events of these per every hour. A moderate rating of sleep apnea is when you have 15 to 30 events per hour, and severe sleep apnea is when you have more than 30 of these events every single hour. So that just kind of puts it into scale. So if you ever hear me talk about AHI or the number of events you had when you're sleeping, this is what I'm referring to. So when I refer to something over 30, that means you have very severe sleep apnea. But if I say you only had 2 events, that means you don't even have sleep apnea. Now the goal would be obviously to have 0 events, but we're going to get into this in just a second. So another thing I want to talk about is the skulls of our ancestors versus our skulls now. The skulls of pre-industrial humans, talking about pre-industrial, so not even super far back, but maybe dating back to the 14th century, they unlikely had sleep apnea. And you might be wondering, how do I know that? I wasn't back there watching them sleep. That's why I said it's unlikely. We don't know for sure. It's very speculative, but there's a lot of evidence that they just couldn't have had sleep apnea. And one reason is they had very spacious jaws. All of their molars, including their third molars, their wisdom teeth, erupted into the right place. And they never had any crowding. And there was no orthodontics or no braces needed back then. They magically had straight teeth. If you look at retrospective data and you look at people who have sleep issues now, you see a lot of them have narrower jaws and they have jaw configurations that were not like our ancestors. And this is how we can determine that it would be very unlikely that our ancestors had sleep apnea or sleep issues or even snored, because their airways were just too open. The way that their jaws were developed, the way that their breathing tubes were developed, it was just very unlikely for them to have some obstructions when they're sleeping. So this is one reason why mandibular appliances work. So if you've never heard of that before, it's basically when some dentists try to treat sleep apnea, they have this device that pulls your lower jaw forward. And there's a bunch of different versions of this, but in a nutshell, all it's doing is pulling your jaw forward and preventing it from going back and constricting your airway. So this is one of the reasons why those work so well. Now, there's obviously some issues that come with that because it can throw off your bite. So every morning you're supposed to bite on this stick that kind of reminds you of how you're supposed to be biting. But that's an alternative to a CPAP, and it works for a lot of people. I don't want to get into too much on our breathing and how it affects our facial structure. Most of the time, this happens as our jaws are developing, so when we're a kid. And for a lot of you watching, it would be really hard for you to change your facial structure. You know, obviously we can get surgery done. That's one way, but there are ways we can improve it. But I'm going to get into that in a different video topic. I know there's a lot of things I'm talking about that I'm going to get into a different video, but I'm going to focus on sleep here. So basically what happened is with processed foods, with us changing our methods of eating, for example, like using a fork and a knife, or getting lazier and eating softer foods and also this chronic stress that we've had, all of these things combined to change our facial structure and change our breathing. And now we're getting all the, I don't want to say benefits, we're reaping all the problems that come from that change. So a quick, easy way to improve your sleep is to simply use your nose. You want to use your nose all night long. In a nutshell, the easiest way to do that is putting a nasal dilator strip over your nose. You can also get an internal dilator that basically dilates your nose. Whichever one works for you, I can put a link to a couple in the description below. But you want to use a nasal dilator and you want to use a mouth tape. So mouth tape is just any piece of tape. You can get any surgical tape, small strip of it just going over your lips to force you to breathe through your nose all night long. Doing this, there's plenty of evidence now that we have that says that this can prevent sleep apnea. It can even potentially cure or at least lower the severity of sleep apnea and even prevent snoring. So I'm not going to list a whole bunch of studies. I did that in a different podcast where I talk about sleep apnea, and I'll put a link to that description in the description below. But one of the studies I wanted to mention was they had two different groups. And one of the groups, they forced to breathe through their mouth all night long. And the other group, they forced to breathe through their nose all night long. What they found is the group that was breathing through their mouth had a 2.5 times increase in their airway resistance. So it was 2.5 times harder for them to get air into their lungs when they're comparing to the group that was breathing through their nose. Now, just to backtrack, these are all normal subjects. These are healthy people, by the way. They don't have any other conditions going on. And also with the mouth breathing group, they suddenly developed sleep apnea. So their AHI, or the number of events that they had, was 43. Now, if you remember from before, that means they had very extremely severe sleep apnea. And the other group, they only had 1.5 events. So they weren't even on the sleep apnea scale. So suddenly, just breathing through your mouth will transition these healthy people to having severe sleep apnea. Another study I wanted to mention was, it was looking at people that simply opened up their nasal passages. So they didn't do anything about taping their mouth shut, but they helped dilate their nasal passages a little bit and how it looked at how it affected their sleep apnea. So these people in this study, they already had sleep apnea. They had a more moderate sleep apnea. So they had 15 to 30 events per hour. And they were looking at the effects of using a nasal decongestant, so like a nasal spray, and also a nasal dilator on sleep apnea. So what they did was they tracked their sleep overnight, and there was two different groups. So one group, they sprayed a real nasal decongestant, and they used a real nasal dilator. And the other group was a placebo. So they had like a fake nasal strip where it didn't really do anything, and they sprayed a placebo up their nose. So I'm not sure what they sprayed exactly. I can look back into the study. I'll link it below, but that's basically the gist of it. And what they found is the group that was the placebo, they were breathing through their mouth 39% of the time at nighttime. And the group that had the decongestant and the nasal strip only breathed through their mouth 8% of the time. So they didn't tape their mouth shut or anything. They just put a nasal strip over their nose, and they put a decongestant in their nose. Simply doing that lowered their amount of times that they were breathing through their mouth, and it also lowered their sleep apnea. So the group that had the decongestant and the nasal dilator strip, their apnea levels went down 12 events per hour. So basically, these people went from having moderate sleep apnea to being either potentially cured of sleep apnea or went down to a mild level of sleep apnea by simply putting a nasal dilator on their nose and spraying a nasal decongestant. There was no CPAP involved, no surgery involved, no mandibular advancement device involved, simply a piece of plastic that goes over the nose and a nasal decongestant. So what the studies are showing is that when you relieve your nasal breathing and you make it easier to breathe through your nose, it can clearly lower sleep apnea in some people. So when you combine using a mouth tape and a nasal dilator, you can get both of these benefits. And it's a very easy, simple trick. And this will also help dilate your nasal passages, because you might be thinking, hey, look, I hear what you're saying about breathing through your nose, but I simply can't do it. My nose is always blocked. I have these allergies. I have a deviated septum. Just know that a lot of people, they can have these issues, but they can still breathe comfortably through their nose. For example, 60% of people have a deviated septum, but a majority of those people can still comfortably breathe through their nose. The trick is to start using your nose more. When your nose remains dormant for a long period of time, it will sort of clog up and fill with mucus and basically make it harder for you to breathe through your nose. So it's kind of like a never-ending cycle where you're forced to breathe through your mouth more. Now, there's a specific exercise you can do to sort of unclog your nose. Now, the way to do this exercise is there's actually 3 steps. The first step is if you really cannot breathe through your nose, you want to spray a nasal decongestant into your nose because you want to really clean your nose out so that you can properly at least do this exercise. If you can kind of breathe through your nose, but it's a little stuffy, you can try to get away without doing this step, but I still recommend doing the nasal decongestant spray. So the second step is to cover your mouth. So you're not going to use your mouth at all this whole exercise. And you're going to take a small inhale and exhale through your nose. So kind of like this. And then you're going to hold your nose shut and you're going to hold your breath and you're going to walk as many paces as you can until you have a medium to strong urge to breathe. So again, it's going to look like this. And then I'm going to start walking until I have a very strong urge to breathe, but not until I am dying to breathe. So if after you're done, you feel like you're panting for air and you have to open your mouth to catch your breath, you did it way too long. You want to basically be able to recover your breathing in 1 to 2 breaths through your nose, and then you want to wait a minute and repeat it. So you're going to do this exercise for 6 times, and you're going to wait a minute in between every single time, and you want to recover by only using your nose. So another way to do this if you don't want to walk around in public or you're in a really confined space is you can do the same thing. You can take a small breath in and out through your nose, and then you can kind of bob your head back and forth. And it's going to look kind of like this. So again, you do this until you have a very strong urge to breathe, but not until you're dying to breathe. And you will recover by breathing through your nose for 1 minute. And again, you're going to do this a total of 6 times. If you do this exercise, your nose should be pretty open. And there's a reason why this will sort of dilate our nose and dilate our nasal passages and make it easier to breathe through our nose. And one reason is we have these receptors in our brain. Now, these receptors, one of them is responsible for tracking the volume that goes in and out of our lungs. If it senses that the volume exchange is too fast, it will actually secrete more mucus or cause more mucus to build up in your nose. The reason behind that is it's basically trying to prevent you from breathing too quickly, because when you breathe too quickly, you're expelling a lot of CO2. So you're getting rid of a lot of carbon dioxide in your body. So instead, when you do this exercise and you're holding your breath and you're only using your nose to recover, you're increasing the CO2, you're increasing the carbon dioxide levels in your body. And when your brain senses that your CO2 levels are building up, it starts to prevent your nose from building up more mucus. So it gets rid of a lot of that mucus and it starts dilating those nasal passages. Another reason that this exercise works is because of nitric oxide. So nitric oxide is a very powerful molecule. And this molecule does 2 specific things. One is it's a vasodilator, and the second thing is it's an antibacterial. So when nitric oxide is released, and it's only released when we're breathing through our nose, it can actually improve our gas exchange, and it can also dilate our blood vessels. So it basically makes it easier for oxygen to get transported from our lungs. And also it's an antibacterial, so when you start breathing through your nose regularly, you're less likely to get sick because this can help fight off a lot of infections. Now, when you are sleeping, and let's say you do this exercise and it works, the next thing you want to do is you want to tape your mouth shut before you go to sleep, because now that you can breathe through your nose, you want to make sure you do not switch to mouth breathing, because if you do switch back to mouth breathing, it's going to quickly clog your nose up again. So you want to sort of train your body to start breathing through your nose again. And when you do go to sleep, you want to sleep on either your side or your stomach. I know some people have said that it's better to sleep on your back, but when you have an issue sleeping, you don't want to sleep on your back, because one thing that can happen is your tongue can fall back with gravity, and this can sort of constrict your breathing tubes and constrict that diameter for that air to get into your lungs. And this can contribute to sleep apnea and also snoring. So you definitely don't want to do that. So it's better to sleep on your side or sleep on your stomach until you get in the habit of regularly breathing through your nose. Now, another thing you want to focus on is keeping your tongue against the roof of your mouth, because when your tongue is resting against the roof of your mouth, it's pretty much impossible for you to breathe through your mouth. Look, I can't do it. Now, not just the tip of your tongue. You want the tip of your tongue to be right behind your incisors or the front teeth, and you want the middle part of your tongue to be against the roof of your mouth. And you want to even try to get the back third of your tongue up to the roof of your mouth. This is how our ideal tongue posture should be. And if we have our posture like this, it is going to help us in a lot of different ways, but it's also going to force us to breathe through our nose, which is going to, again, make sure that we're getting quality air and getting more oxygen delivery to our cells, and this is going to help us sleep. So one of the biggest reasons that breathing through your nose is so much better for you is that it will improve your oxygen absorption. So when you breathe through your nose versus when you breathe through your mouth, you get way more oxygen delivery to all your cells, including your brain. And this is going to help make sure that you are not chronically tired. So it may sound counterintuitive to breathe through your nose and build up more CO2, but this is ultimately what's going to help you get more oxygen delivery to your cells. The last step to clean your nose is to use a nasal spray. So my favorite nasal spray is something called Clear, but it's with an X, so it's spelled Xlear. This nasal spray has xylitol in it. So xylitol is very cool to use in a nasal spray for a few different reasons. First is